Hello, I'm Liselle Sambury and welcome back to my channel where I talk about all things writing, traditional publishing, and a little bit of reading. And this is my annual How I Make Money as a Full-Time Author video. In this video, I talk a little bit about where my income comes from an author. I also talk about how it breaks down into things like taxes, retirement. I've also added a new segment for this year talking specifically about author expenses, and the sort of things that are unique to being an author that I spent money on. And so that is really what this video is about. I also talk a little bit about what I learned about author finances through the year. Throughout this video, I share percentages. I don't do actual figures. So if that's something you're looking for, that is not what you will find in this video, just so that I can keep my full financial picture private. So that's everything that's going to be explored in the video. I will also say up front that I am not a financial expert. I am not an accountant. I am not a financial advisor. I am not giving financial advice. I'm just sharing how my income breaks down and sharing some of the things that I learned in the hopes that maybe that's helpful to you, but your situation may be very different. I think probably everyone's financial situation will be very different in some ways. So just sharing that little disclaimer. And then the final disclaimer before we jump into this video is I like to share a little bit about the privileges that allow me to write full time. I think there are a lot of things that go into the decision to be a full-time author, and I just like to be transparent and upfront about those, so that if people are thinking about like whether or not they'd like to write full-time, they can kind of be aware of the full scope of things. So for one, I live in Canada, which does matter because I have access to universal healthcare, and so really at the baseline level I have quite good healthcare, and then on top of that I'm also on my partner's insurance, and so I am covered in that way. My partner and I also split expenses. My income is necessary. It's not the case in which my partner's income could support both of us, and so I do need to contribute and I do need to have a job. If I didn't write full-time, I would have to get a day job, and that's usually been the situation before, as I had a day job and I also wrote, but splitting expenses does make things cheaper. I also don't have any dependents, so I don't have any children. I don't have any family members relying on me for care and for income. And then I used to not have any debt, but we did a bunch of home renovations, so now I do. But that being said, we live in a place with a fairly low cost of living. I'm not living in like a city where it might be really expensive to live there. I live in a pretty low cost sort of place, and we also own our own home, and so we're not really dealing with kind of a landlord rising, fluctuating rent prices, that sort of thing. Really just property tax fluctuating, and even that it doesn't do that much. So that's kind of just the full scope. I just like to be very clear and transparent about that because I do, like I said before, think it helps people make the decisions and to kind of understand everything that goes into being able to do this. It's not just as simple as, oh, well, I got this chunk of money for my advance from a publisher, and so now I can write full time. There are a lot of different things. So without further ado, let's jump into this video and the charts. Now that I've been writing full-time for a little bit, I have some more general across the year information. And so this is my income over the last 3 years. It's actually been kind of surprisingly steady, which I personally have been very shocked by. The breakdown of like how much I've paid in taxes and things like that has changed over years, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is just kind of my gross income from 2021, 2022, and 2023, just so you can kind of see how that's been going up and down. But I've, been very happy and pleasantly surprised to see it be very steady, and I would like to really maintain this steadiness. Of course, like, you know, who doesn't want more money? But I've been very happy with my take home for the last 3 years, and I think being able to maintain that steadiness over my career as an author would be really amazing. So that's kind of the general look at my gross income year over year. Now my income sources. So these are all the different places that I got income from during the year and the breakdown in percentages of how much each one contributed to my gross income. So I'm going to start with talking about advances. So advances account for 42.3% of my overall income. And the advances I got were the advance for Tender Beasts, the advance for the All These Sunken Souls anthology, the advance for the Today I Am anthology, which is the middle grade one, and then also some foreign rights that I sold. So that was everything that made up the advances. Though I will say, if we broke it down further, the Tender Beast advance is what is accounting really for the largest portion of this, which is pretty typical in that I usually have like one main book deal that is powering my income, and there may be other kind of smaller deals alongside that for things like foreign rights or anthologies, but the bulk of what my income is made up of usually comes from that main advance. Next is royalties. So royalties account for 22.9% of my overall income. Royalties, if you don't know, are payments you get when your books have earned out of their advance. So you have earned back the money that you were paid for the advance through sales, and you are now being paid for each sale on top of that. And so I get royalties twice a year, at the end of March and at the end of September. And my publisher is pretty like on the dot about that, which is great because I know some publishers don't pay royalties on time, and that can be really frustrating. And I get royalties for both Blood Like Magic and Blood Like Fate. So I have two titles that I'm receiving royalties for. And I expect these to kind of go down because now both Blood Like Magic and Blood Like Fate are in paperback, and I get less royalties per book on paperbacks than I get on hardcovers. And so usually once both books are in paperback, I kind of expect these to be lower. I tend to not rely on royalties as part of my income just because they're so kind of unpredictable. Like I can't really guess at what all those sales will be, and even though I, have access to a sales portal, it's just something that's very hard to predict. And so usually when I am planning for the year, I basically just kind of count on my advances as kind of a guaranteed money payment, and then royalties kind of become bonus. So if they come and I get some, that's amazing. But I'm really planning based on not getting any, just because it's really hard to be sure whether these are going to continue or not, especially like the longer your book is out, the less people usually are buying it. Like you usually get your most sales kind of when it first comes out, and then they kind of steadily go down unless something like really big happens for your book. And so that's kind of what I expect, is for these to kind of decrease each year. But we'll see, because I do have more titles that are publishing, and so when you add on more titles, there's potential there. But yeah, we will see. Next is bonuses. Bonuses account for 5% of my overall income. Bonuses, if you don't know about them, are essentially kind of extra amounts of money that your publisher promises you. They're written into the contract, and they are for doing certain things. So for hitting certain bestseller lists, for winning certain awards, for earning out the book in a certain period of time, etc., etc. I guess kind of bonuses can be anything, but those are the ones that I've heard of. And since these are written into your contract, these are confidential. I got a bonus from my very first deal. That's the Blood Like Magic, Blood Like Fate deal. I cannot say why because it's confidential, but I'm pretty sure you can guess. So I got one bonus in that case, which was, as I said, 5% of my income. Grants is the next section, which accounts for 22.6% of my overall income. I got a Canada Arts grant for working on the Couples Retreat, which is my adult thriller, which is basically a full rewrite of a previous adult horror thriller. And so I got a grant to work on that in 2023, and that accounts for also a very large chunk of my income. The grant grant is very helpful, especially the Canada Arts Grant, which is like a fairly large chunk. And so I find that it tends to account for a pretty significant portion of my income when I do get a grant that year. I've talked in previous videos more about specifically the process of applying for a Canada Arts Grant and like details about how that works. So if you are Canadian, I will put a link in the description to the last How I Make Money as a Full-Time Author video with a timestamp if you want to learn more about the Canada Arts Grant. I also did a TikTok where I talked kind of at a length about the process as well, and I believe one more where I answered a question, and so I will put those both down below if you want to check those out and learn more about the Canada Arts Grant, which I highly recommend applying for if you are an author applying for a Canada Arts Grant, or if you're in Ontario, different provinces, and I believe territories also have arts grants in certain cities. I find these to be very, very helpful, and they are worth applying for because they can be really great in helping you helping support you and support your art. Honorariums, which account for 5.7% of my overall income. Honorariums are things that or payments that I get for doing events or other associated services. So it can be kind of a bit of a variety of things. I mostly get these for events, and usually only doing events in Canada, though in this case, the payments are for 3 events. One, like Q&A sort of thing that I did in the US, and so virtually I didn't go to the US, and so that's where that one US payment comes from. And I also include peer reviewing in this, so sometimes I am asked to participate in peer review for things like the grant the grant scheme. You could also peer review, or not really peer review I suppose, but like if you're on like a panel for like reviewing for a contest, that sort of thing, you might also get an honorarium. And so those are where those come from. And again, like I said, I usually get these in Canada. I suspect because Canada has a lot of grants, and so because people can apply for grants, they're able to pay out in that way. So that's usually where mine come from. I feel like these might decrease over years because I've kind of changed which events I'm okay with doing. And that being said, I don't really want to do presentations anymore. And a lot of what I get offered do tend to be presentations. I also turned down some presentations in this case because, again, I don't really want to be doing presentations. And so for me, this is kind of dependent on what I'm cool with doing or cool with not doing. And so I feel like I got asked to do a fair amount of things, but some things I ended up saying no to, which I feel like earlier in my career, I said yes to a lot of things. And so I had a bit more honorarium, but as I've gone further in my career, I've kind of taken on less of that to focus a little bit more on book things, and I've been a little bit more cognizant of what sort of events I enjoy doing and what sort of events really just kind of bring me stress and anxiety. And so I feel like that kind of accounts for a lot of the shifting this year. Next one is public lending right, which is a new one this year, and this accounts for 0.7% of my income. So the public lending right is a thing in Canada in which the government gives you money essentially for people borrowing your book from the library. And so when people borrow your book from the library, you get like a portion of money, and you have to apply for this every year if you have new titles coming out. So you have to apply when you have new titles, or if your title is available in a new format. So for example, if you only had a hardcover before and now you have a paperback, you have to apply again for the paperback in case libraries buy the paperback, and that's what they have in circulation, so that you are getting payments from all of your different formats. And so this payment I got for 2023 was only for the Blood Like Magic hardcover. And so since then I've applied for more titles, so including the Blood Like Magic paperback, the Blood Like Fate hardback, and also the Delicious Monsters hardback. And so that may affect how things go forward into the future, and you can add on more titles as you publish more things. But it's nice because it's kind of like you get a little bit of money for people borrowing from libraries, and so I feel like that contributes to me just kind of being like, I don't care if you buy my book or you get it from the library. Either way, I will get some sort of portion of that, which is a benefit in Canada. And I believe it's only Canadian libraries in that case as well. I don't think they're going and counting US libraries in that. So that was a new one, and it was exciting. It wasn't like it was a giant amount of money, but money is money, and I was very happy with that. Event sales account for 0.2% of my income. This is really just one event. So I did a library event, and we, like, by the time I had committed to it, we found out that we couldn't get a vendor, and so I had to sell copies, and so then I was taking that money directly, and so I figured I would count this as a separate thing because it was a little bit different. And lastly, YouTube accounts for 0.6% of my overall income. This is purely from AdSense, as I didn't do anything sponsored in 2023. And so that is really kind of it. Now YouTube seems to be paying out every month no matter what. They used to be you had to earn a minimum of $100. So yeah, I'm cool with that. And this works really well for me doing 2 YouTube videos a month. I don't really feel like doing more, and I also don't rely on YouTube income. And so I'm happy to get whatever I get. And now here is a chart showing the differences in my income sources from 2021 to 2023. So overall, my advance amounts have gone down, which makes sense to me because I got my largest payment for that Delicious Monsters Tender Beast deal in the beginning of 2021, and then the payment breakdowns were smaller over the years, and I hadn't yet figured out a way to spread out my advance payments in a more even manner. More on that later. And so it makes sense to me that it is very high one year and then lower in other years. I thought my royalties were actually going to be lower this year because one book went into paperback. Blood Like Magic was into paperback already, but they were actually higher, so that was a pleasant surprise to me. So I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe when they're both in paperback, that won't necessarily mean my royalties will go down. Maybe more people will buy them, and so we'll see. I will be interested in seeing what this is, but otherwise everything else was pretty steady. It's kind of maintained generally the same amount from 2021 to 2023, which I like because I appreciate steadiness and like consistency, and for me consistency in my income is really great and really helpful, and so to be honest, the more kind of consistent things can be, the better. And I also found this really interesting considering things like honorariums, in which I've actually done less events than I had done in previous years, but I guess maybe my fee is a little bit higher. And usually, almost always, I personally am not choosing a fee. Usually people are like, it'll be this much for this event, and I either say yay or nay. I think maybe other authors might like set specific fees for appearances, but I just don't. There's not really a good reason for that. I think I truly am just kind of too lazy to bother, and so I don't do it. But I know, especially for school visits, and that's the thing, I don't do school visits. So when people do school visits, they tend to set their rates for that specifically because it's a whole presentation, and there's just a little bit more, I think, standardization in that case, in that people kind of expect you to have a fee for school visits. So that tends to be more of a thing. But yeah, otherwise pretty steady. And there are some things here where like something only happened 1 year. So that award nomination only happened 1 year. So it's got a little tick for 1 year, and then the other years it's nothing. And so that is same with like public lending, right? Sometimes that happens, something only happens 1 year. So, but otherwise, yeah, pretty steady. And now we are on to the income breakdown. And so this is the different ways that my income ends up split between certain things like retirement and taxes. So starting with retirement accounts for 16.1% of my overall income. Just the way that I do this, and the way it works in Canada, it's very specific, but I was able to put away the maximum amount for retirement that I was allotted this year, which I was really happy about. Though more on this later, but I have a financial planner now and he seems to not really like my strategy of doing that. So I guess I might be doing things differently in future years. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later and the whole thing with a financial planner, etc., etc. But that is essentially how much I did for retirement based on my own very loose system. Savings accounted for 13.6% of my overall income. This has been a trend for me, in that I think it was in 2021, I talked about wanting to save more. And so then in 2022, I saved a bunch and then I spent everything I saved before the end of the year. And this year, in 2023 rather, was no different in that I saved a bunch and then I spent everything I saved, because I tend to be saving specifically for like things like travel, and so I'm kind of put money away for each kind of trip or thing that I want to do that year. And so because I'm putting it away specifically for those things, by the time those things come up, I tend to have kind of spent all of that money on them. And so what happens is at the end of the year, I then have no savings at all. And so I think going forward, what I would really like to do is to have more savings that I am not touching and that I'm not using, because I would love to be in a bigger house with more office space for all of my crafts and books. And so I'd like to save a little bit more for, you know, potentially upgrading in the future, and more of those kind of don't touch that sort of savings. And so that's something I'm wanting to do in future years. So yeah, I saved this amount of money, but by the end of the year, all of this was gone. Now we're going to get into taxes. So before we jump into the breakdown for this year, I wanted to do a little swap over to a different chart, and I wanted to show the difference between my actual and my estimated tax payments. So when I do these videos, I'm doing them early in the year, and tax season isn't until April. So I don't usually learn until about May what I'm actually paying in taxes for the year. And so when I do this video, I'm doing my estimated amount of taxes. So what I have estimated and saved for, based on what I believe I will end up paying in taxes for the year. And so now that I have a kind of backlog of years, I figured I'd go back to 2021 and 2022, just to show what was the difference between what I estimated I'd pay in taxes and what I actually paid in taxes. So in 2021, 6% of what I estimated I did not end up owing. So that just ended up being cash, which I usually threw into savings, which I usually spent. So that was 2021. And in 2022, 32% of what I estimated I did not owe. So in 2022, the big difference is that my accountant gave me a website to help me better predict my taxes. Because if you check my 2021 video, I wasn't a great estimator. And then in fact, in 2021, because of where I'd put my savings, I'd actually lost a little bit of money and I had to really like scramble to get enough for my taxes, even though I'd estimated right, but I had not saved right. Anyway, I digress. I'm better at estimating my tax amount now. And so I almost always estimate over, and end up paying less. And so I expect that, you know, I'm going to tell you the tax breakdown for this video and it's going to be estimated, but based on how 2022 went, I will probably pay like 30% of that I will probably not owe, in which case those can become savings. I hope that made sense. I hope that all made sense. But yeah, so that I just wanted to show the difference between like estimations and actuals, since I have some of that data now. And now we'll go back to the original chart of the breakdown. And so again, this is the estimated amount. So in 2023, taxes accounted for 23.7% of my income. Again, an estimation, but I always put away this full amount because I would rather overestimate and just have it set aside and know. And so the reason the estimation and the actual are different, in case I didn't make that clear, is because I write off certain things as an author as business expenses, that sort of thing, but I don't know how those calculations are going to come out until my accountant actually puts those through. And so that's why I do this estimation for the whole year, because I'm just really not sure how things will shake out. So that's taxes. And lastly, what I'm calling the leftover, which accounts for 46.6% of my income, which is essentially everything that I have left. I believe in the past I called this section like leisure money, which like suggested that I just like could spend that amount of money on whatever, but that chunk of money I actually spend on like, I spend a bunch of that on like general bills that have like nothing to do with being an author, just like house bills and things like that. This amount of money is not just like free to the wind money. I spend a lot of this on things like my household bills and things like that. And I would talk a little bit more also about the author expenses and like what I spend on that in that upcoming author expenses section. But I just thought I'd rename this section so it's a little bit more accurate to what it is being spent on. And here is the income breakdown differences from 2021 to 2022. So my retirement goes down consistently just because of the way the whole retirement system works with what I'm doing in Canada. I am allowed to put in less and less every year. And so the first year, because I'd never before ever contributed to it, I was able to put in a lot, and then over the years that has decreased, and because what I'm able to put into retirement affects what my income is seen as, that has also kind of affected taxes. So like the more you put into retirement, the less you pay in taxes. And so when I was able to put in a lot in retirement, I paid less in taxes. And when I was able to put in less, I paid more in taxes. And so they really kind of fluctuate year over year, more based on that than based on kind of things that I'm doing. It's not like I chose to put less in. It's just kind of how it shakes out. So this is a little bit of a weird section year by year. But that's basically why there are those fluctuations. Now we're on to the new author expenses section. I just thought this would be helpful in kind of giving a little bit of a picture of the sort of expenses that you might incur as an author, or what you might be spending your money on in your author business, just because I thought that would be interesting to kind of see that sort of breakdown, and those sorts of things. So these are percentages based on gross amounts. So the percentage based on the total amount I spent on all author expense things and like how much I spent per expense. So that is essentially what you will be looking at. I'm continuing to do percentages again for my own privacy. Yeah, I gotta keep some things a mystery. And I will also do a disclaimer in saying this is not what you should be spending on author expenses. I'm not saying this is prescriptive in any way, or that like this is how your expenses should break down or anything like that. I'm really just showing how mine do, so that you can kind of just see what that might look like. So that's really the total purpose of this. So let's go ahead and get started. So I have some overall stats first. So what I spend on my expenses, like author expenses, account for 21% of my overall gross income. Just so you can kind of see how much of my like full income is being spent on this. What I spend in for these expenses is I use my savings, again, that money that runs out at the end of the year, that savings, and I also use that leftover leftover money. I use a combination of those two to pay for these things. Some authors like to set aside a specific amount of money, so you know they get their advance and they set aside a specific amount of money for those things. I don't do that. I think because for me some of these things are very much in flux, so if I had less money to play with in a year, I would probably just spend less on some of these things. There's not like a set amount that I know I'm going to spend for the year or a set amount that I like to set aside. It's really kind of just based on my lifestyle and how things are going for me. I'd rather do things kind of ad hoc in that way than like setting aside a chunk of money that I might end up needing for some, you know, personal emergency or something like that, which I'm sure people just pull from as they need, but I just rather do it in this way. So what I spend on expenses accounts for 35% of my savings and leftover money. I ended up using all of my savings for that year on some of these things. Again, this is because I usually save up money for travel, and travel, as you'll see, is like a pretty extensive part of this, and then plus some of that like leftover section money. Website stuff, starting with, this accounts for 1.3% of my expenses. So this is really for my hosting and my domain name. So my domain name, which is lisellesambury.ca, I pay for that yearly, but in case of hosting, so the way I've done it is I have a hosting provider and I paid an upfront amount for kind of a period of time for like 3 years or something like that. But what happened is that my website kept getting like targeted by bots, and I also had some just like general increased web traffic, and because that happened, it increased the resources my website was using, and then my website provider was like, you have to upgrade, you're using too many resources. And so I had to keep upgrading, and then I upgraded my security as well so that I could stop having so many of those bot things happen. And so that kind of drove it up for the year, but it was still kind of, in the overall of my expenses, fairly minimal. But those are kind of the things that you might need to think about when you are kind of hosting a website yourself. It's just the way that I do my website. I think it would probably be simpler if I was doing it through something like Squarespace, but that's not what I chose to do. I'm doing it through WordPress, so it's a little bit more complicated. 4% of expenses was spent on software technology. So these are things like Microsoft Word. I also have a PDF annotation software that I use for things like past pages and for signing documents. I just thought it was easier, and so I just used that. This also includes my Plotter yearly fee, which is the plotting software I use, Google for Business, which is like how I run my business email, those sorts of things. I also include this for promotional assets, like digital assets. So sometimes I want certain digital files in order to create graphics that I share on social media or that I use to promote my books, or like video graphics or things. And so that's the whole of what this software technology section is encompassing. 9.6% of the expenses was spent on hardware technology. So this is like things like my new desk setup, like I got a new standing desk, I got new stands for my computer, cord systems, I got lighting and a new camera for things like YouTube, which I do consider to be part of my author business, because even though it's kind of a very passive, I find often promotion, this is still promotion of me being an author, and I do still promote my books on here. And so tripods also, I did a lot of technology hardware upgrades this year, especially because I wanted to use my new camera to do some promotional videos for Tender Beasts as well. And so also the green screen that I got for Tender Beasts promotion. And so all of those kind of contributed to that cost. Mailing accounted for 1.9% of my overall expenses. I don't do a lot of mailing generally because I'm aware that because I live in Canada, our post office system is like weirdly very expensive, and we don't have things like media mail. And so usually when I am sending a package, it's gonna cost me anywhere between like $15 to $30 to send a book somewhere. And so that adds up really quickly. And so what I've done usually in the years since my debut is I ask to get less physical ARCs sent to me, because I know that I personally am not going to be sending out as many, and my publisher is very good about sending out ARCs to like influencers and people I ask for me, and so I kind of save those mailing prices. I do sometimes donate books in bulk, which contributes to that cost, but I try to kind of just like go in person and give out ARCs to like the local library or the local bookstore to kind of be like, hey, I have a new book coming out. So I do less of that mailing. This also includes things like mailing like supplies, like tape and like packages and things like that. I try and save boxes, but it's kind of hard because we don't really have a ton of space for just kind of saving a lot of things, so I don't always get to save boxes, so sometimes I do end up having to buy boxes, but that's pretty, I try and keep mailing small, and so that's why mailing is small. Promotional accounts for 8% of my author expenses, and so these are kind of, it's a bit of a vague category, but things that are, I guess, like physical and used for promotion. So for example, the pre-order goodie things for Tender Beasts, so I ordered those embroidered patches, and so things like that, that will also come up for that. I also had to order some supplies to do the other like pre-order, what is the word? The like grand prize giveaway items. I had to order things to do that. I also just like tools that I purchased for those sorts of things. And then I also purchased some character art. So the character art that I use to promote A Mastery of Monsters. I also got some other things commissioned for A Mastery of Monsters that I haven't shown off yet. That is kind of coming in the future, but I paid for those in 2023. Those are these sorts of, and also props. So sometimes I do little book photo shoots for promotion, and so there are also props that I'll buy, like little blankets and like candles and stuff that I use to like make those like flat lay aesthetic Instagram photos. Those are also what I'm counting in this section. Office expenses and supplies, which account for 5.5% of my author incomes. These are really just like things for little like office things like signing markers and like signing pens, masks. So when I wear like masks to events and stuff like that, I like to get the N95, and so those masks and things like that. Journals, if I use journals for my writing, that's, which I don't really often, but those do count. Just like office supplies, things, pens, that sort of thing, just kind of general. I'd also like to note that office expenses also includes things like furniture for my office that is not related to like technology, hardware, that sort of thing. And so those kind of bigger ticket items are why my office expense can be higher in some cases. So it's not just like just these little tiny like markers and journals and that sort of thing. Sometimes it's like more furniture items, also like organizational items, like things I use to help with organizing my office, like trays and bins and that sort of thing, which can be a little bit more expensive. And so that's why this percentage is a little bit higher than say something like mailing. Books account for 15.7% of my author expenses, which makes sense to me because reading is part of my job. Being caught up on books that are coming out recently, checking out trends, just kind of learning things from books in general. Also like very specific research type books. In this I also include subscriptions, so things like Scribd and Libro.fm, that sort of thing. And I think, you know, I do understand that I purchase more books than perhaps necessary. And this is why I made this disclaimer in the beginning of like, you don't have to spend money on these things. I choose to do these, especially because I've purchased more physical books in the last few years and I don't necessarily need to. Like, I guess I could do an ebook or an audiobook or something, but I want to do a physical book. It's also helpful in some cases for like highlighting and like annotating and like tabbing and things like that. It's helpful to have a physical one, which I can also do that on ebook, and I do sometimes do that, especially in the case of like some books that are kind of only available in ebook format because of like Amazon publishing or what have you. So yeah, but I acknowledge that the book section is large. And sensitivity reads accounted for 5.1% of this expense. My publisher thankfully does pay for a certain portion of sensitivity reads, but some of these I just end up having to pay out of pocket. And so out of pocket I had to pay for 2 readers, and so that's basically what that amount is coming from. And that was for sensitivity reads for A Mastery of Monsters. These characters will persist in A Mastery of Monsters, so if I get to write all 3 books, I will likely be paying this amount each year that Mastery of Monsters comes out, and so that's just kind of the payment, and I find that they are well worth it. I always find sensitivity reads to be very, very helpful, and very worthwhile and worth the money for me. And finally, travel. Travel is the biggest portion of this, and it accounts for 48.9% of the author expenses, which makes sense to me because travel just tends to be more expensive than other things, and so it just kind of tracks. And this is travel that I do for that includes business purposes, either for business purposes or includes business purposes. So like when I went home for the holidays to visit my family and I didn't do any writing, I didn't put that as part of the expenses because it's not that's not business travel. So this is things like traveling for writing retreats, for events, signings, that sort of thing. And so that's what's included in this travel section. And sometimes my publisher is paying to send me to places. And so the kind of airfare, like they set up that on their end. And so that's not kind of included here, but kind of what I spend on meals and that sort of thing. But you do get reimbursement for things like, you know, meals and like Ubers and that sort of thing. And so some of this section I do end up getting reimbursed for, but I figured it was easier to just put it all together than to be like, this I got reimbursed for, or this I got reimbursed for, etc., etc. So that is how it works in the case of publishers sending me places, but that is essentially kind of the breakdown of that whole travel bit. So it's not just like the flights, it's like the flights and like meals, and like any individual travel, like train travel or cabs or things like that that are included in that, as well as things like hotels and Airbnbs, etc., etc. And all those things tend to be very pricey, and so that I think is really why this ends up being the largest portion. I also did do a lot of travel this year, perhaps overdid it a tiny bit, but I did do a lot of travel this year, which also contributed to that. And this is also why I put away that savings chunk, specifically because I know that I'm going to do a certain amount of travel and that is probably going to be pricey, and so it's worth putting away the money, and that's also why the savings get spent every year. But hope to be better about this. I do really like being able to like travel and do signings and events and that sort of thing. And so I want to continue to do that for sure, and retreats and things like that, which is really helpful. And I don't, you know, it's helpful also to get over to the States and be able to do things like that, because a lot of my readership is in the United States, and so it's helpful to be able to go there and do those things as well. But yeah, I think I'd like to maybe budget these things a little bit better, but that is, yeah, a big chunk of what I spend on author expenses. And again, why I did that disclaimer in the beginning of, you don't really need to do this stuff, like you don't need to go anywhere, you could stay in your local area. But I live very remotely, and so I do also like to be able to get out of the area because it is pretty remote and like far from other authors and events and things like that. And so when I travel, I'm able to have a little bit more opportunity to do different things. So that is the last section of the author expenses. Now for the financial learnings for the year, I will once again disclaimer this section and say that I'm not a financial expert. I'm not giving you financial advice. I am just saying about what I've personally learned from the year, in case that is perhaps helpful for you, but you should always consult a financial expert. So this year we just me, my partner and I, that's who I'm saying we, know someone who does kind of financial advising and planning. And so we ended up just kind of agreeing to work with this person. And I thought this would be a good positive step for me, because originally it was just my partner working with them, and I decided to hop on because I really, in some ways, felt like I had an idea of what I was doing, but in many ways had no idea what I was doing. And I was trying, I think I was learning more and getting better per year, but I'm really not an expert. And I think, you know, my accountant does some things, but a financial planner does different things. And so my accountant is really helpful in like doing my taxes per year, whereas the financial planner advisor is more helpful in getting like a full view of my total finances and suggesting what I can do in order to better organize my money, which I hadn't been doing particularly well on. I think especially because it kind of felt like it was a little bit of a fluke. Like I spent 2021, I was like, I'll never make this amount of money again. And then the next year I made a very similar amount. And then I was like, I'll never make this amount of money again. Then I got into 2023 and I was like, okay, now this is kind of silly. Like I said, I've had a very consistent gross income over the year, which again, I was shocked by and very pleased by, but that meant I was like, okay, this is no longer a fluke. I am sustaining, working full-time as an author. I am sustaining a certain amount of income that is livable for me to write full-time and be very comfortable. And so I was like, okay, now I need to start really thinking about the future and like being an adult about it. And it just felt like a good move to work with a financial planner, which so far for me has been very, very helpful. I found that I was doing a lot of just kind of things that weren't particularly helpful to me and were just kind of stressing me out and increasing my anxiety. And so now I have this person helping me, and it is a little bit scary to shift over that sort of responsibility and have someone else doing those things, which is not to say I don't trust this person, because I trust the person quite a bit. Otherwise I wouldn't let them handle my money. It's just I am generally an anxious person, and I find that it is very difficult to just deal with money stuff in general. But for me, that was part of the purpose of working with someone like that, is so that I could stop being as anxious about those things. So also because I have certain financial goals, like I said, I do want a bigger office for more space for my crafts and that sort of thing. I want to upgrade our house, and so I'm really trying to figure out how to do that. So that was a big kind of learning and thing for me to do this year. And the second was that I actually finally like had a conversation with my agent about how I could better spread out my payments and like find some sort of system to work so that I wasn't having this issue where I was getting way too much money in one year and then like way like too little money in another year. Especially because we were already working through a new contract, which was the contract for A Mastery of Monsters and its sequel. And so I was just kind of like, okay, I don't want what happened with the Delicious Monsters Tender Beast deal to happen again. So how can we work together to like amend this? And I was able to work with my agency to do something. This will be very specific again to you and your agency, but I guess kind of my own, this is where I'm giving advice. It's not financial advice, but I'm giving advice, which is if you are having an issue, ask your agent and see what you can do together, instead of just being like, well, I guess that's how it is, and just moving on with your life, which is what I did and like screwed myself a little bit, when I could have just like had a conversation with my agent and be like, hey, is there a way to make this better for me, and come to a resolution, which you may or may not be able to do, but it is certainly worth asking. And I definitely am kicking my past self for not just being like, hey, what could we do? So that was kind of another learning for me this year. And now just kind of some final thoughts on my 2024 financial future, I suppose. I'm feeling very good. I feel very calm. I feel like I'm finally starting to get a handle on this whole thing which maybe it took me a little bit too long, but I think that's really fair. Like writing full time and being an author and juggling expenses and being self-employed, these are all things that were extremely new to me, and so there were a lot of learning curves and things like that that I had to go through, but I'm feeling very good about 2024. This is the first year in which I don't have some sort of like financial panic of like, oh no, I don't have enough money to live next year, or like, oh no, am I gonna get a grant that I applied to, or like, oh no, am I gonna sell a book? And this is kind of like the first year where I don't have any of that happening. I'm like, I'm good for this year, I'm good for next year. Everything feels calm. This is also the first year that I didn't apply for a grant because I was like, I'm actually good for this year. We were able to work things out, and so things are better spread out, and so I did not end up in that position of like being like blah and like panicking, and so I didn't end up needing the grant to help supplement my income so that it could be a livable income. I was able to be fine just on my own, which was great. I also made some big hardware investments in 2023 in terms of like my camera setup and that sort of thing, and so I'm very excited about the promotional things I'll be able to do now that I couldn't do super well before or at all, and I've already kind of taken advantage of that. You'll see as they trickle out some of the Tender Beast promotional content I've been able to make doing that, which has been really wonderful and amazing, and so I'm really happy about that, and I'd like to kind of continue to upgrade those. I would in the future love to upgrade my computer. I've been working off a MacBook Air laptop, and some of these, like there are some kind of more hardcore video things that I'd be able to do with a more desktop computer with like higher processing functions. For example, Adobe After Effects allows you to have a lot of really like cool video effects that you could do that I could use to make some like really awesome promotional material, but my laptop physically cannot run it. It's an extremely high load program and the attempt to try and make my laptop run it has been like laughable. It is so extremely laggy. My computer fan goes on high speed. It is basically screaming I'm dying when I try and do it. So I'd like to be able to upgrade that in the future, because I always want to try and like see what different types of promotional things I can do. I don't necessarily know that these things are like super moving the needle in terms of like selling books, but I really like doing them, and I really like being able to share different types of videos with my audience that really enjoy the books, and getting to do those different things. And so that's really kind of a personal goal thing for me. And kind of finally, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, I feel like I spent 2021 and 2022 and like even like some of 2023 kind of feeling like me writing full time and like maintaining a livable wage was like a little bit of a fluke, and so it was hard for me to like make serious financial decisions because I kind of always felt like well, this is never gonna happen again, and I feel like now I've kind of settled more into being like, okay, this is what I'm doing. I do feel confident that I can maintain a career as an author, and I'm trying to be more mindful of my finances in that case, of like getting to continue and like trying to be a little bit more decisive and specific, and also trying to be a little bit more cautious about my spending now too. I think I was in a bit of a scarcity mindset, and so I feel like I was spending more than I ought to on certain things, and so I think you'll probably, maybe next year you'll see some differences in those author expenses, or maybe not, because I guess it's more of the percentages than like the overall amount. But for me, the overall amount, I'd like to be a little bit more mindful about where my money goes and that sort of thing. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. Link in the description. I also will have the videos from 2021 and 2022 if you want to check those out. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!